Wes Huff has commented on the Book of Enoch several times, and while most of the stuff he says is true, he's clearly not up to date with the best arguments. For example, on a Twitter post, he's talking about the Book of Enoch and trying to make a case for why it shouldn't be in Scripture. Of course, he doesn't mention the countless list of Christian authors that considered it Scripture in biblical and early Christian time periods. He compiles a list of all the Christian canon lists from before the 5th century of what these writers supposedly consider Scripture. In it, he says, we have more than 20 early Christian canon lists between the 2nd and 5th centuries. None of these lists contain Enoch within the contents of canonical books. And that sounds great. It's like, oh, wow. Seems like nobody considered it Scripture. That's a lot of lists in a long time period, and really early in Christianity. Of course, this is incorrect by a long shot, but what he doesn't tell you is that Melito of Sardis is the only text in this list that is most likely 2nd century. Also, Melito is just telling you what some Jews in Palestine told him was the Jewish scriptures. That doesn't mean all Jews of the day thought Enoch wasn't in there. The Muratorian fragment is highly debated. It very well could have been written much later. Origen is 3rd century, and the rest on the list is 4th century or greater, which is essentially useless as far as figuring out what the apostles believed. So not only does Wes not mention the long list of people that saw Enoch as Scripture, he gives you an extremely misleading list as if nobody saw Enoch as Scripture. He also says, but just because the early Christians seemed unanimous on its non-inspired status does not mean they were unaware, hiding, or had banned it. Tertullian, the 2nd century church historian, actually goes on record advocating for it, not as Scripture, but as a useful book to read. And not only is Wes completely off base that Enoch was some kind of text that is barely Scripture to anybody, like way, way off base here, the list of ancient texts that consider Enoch as Scripture is huge. It's a really long list. Ancient Jews really cared about this text and saw it as Scripture during this time period. Maybe not everybody, but a lot of people did. It is nowhere close the way Wes portrays this as. The one person that he mentions that uses it as a useful book, Tertullian, actually very explicitly clearly thought it was Scripture, so much that he treats Enoch as Scripture, defends its authority against Jewish rejection, and even appeals to 2 Timothy 3:16, which says all Scripture is God-breathed, to include Enoch within the category of divinely inspired writings. Many more could be mentioned, but Tertullian, Irenaeus, Origen, and Clement spoke of Enoch as inspired by using the phrase, for Scripture says, or for it is written, which are stereotypical phrases ancient writers used to refer to Scripture. Wes later claims that no Jewish collections had Enoch as Scripture, which is simply not true. One of the first things you learn about when you look into the topic of Enoch is that the Essenes from the Dead Sea, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they saw Enoch as Scripture. It seems like he's also conveniently leaving out how most scholars think Jude saw Enoch as Scripture. He then says the Ethiopian Jewish community accepts it as Scripture, but it only goes back to the 3rd century AD. It's really interesting that he said this, though, because his really long list of canon lists of people that reject Enoch are almost all from the 4th century or later. So tell me this, why does the 4th century matter only when it justifies your view, but then the 3rd century, oh, it's no biggie? Of course, he says it is not part of the Jewish Tanakh, but why is that such a big deal? The Jewish Tanakh was not decided until the 3rd century or later, and that was only a specific set of Jews. Now, Josephus is an interesting case of an early person that doesn't seem to accept Enoch, but he certainly doesn't discuss if Enoch is in. But Wes Huff certainly doesn't discuss if Enoch is in Josephus' scripture. For one, it's not explicitly mentioned. Also, scholars like Lee Martin MacDonald think Josephus was in the minority on his views of scripture. Also, the earliest clear mention of a Jewish Tanakh was in the 2nd century, but the structure would be debated for many years later in Jewish culture. Of course, Wes takes the very evangelical position of Jude, just referencing Enoch. not considering it scripture. But what he doesn't mention is the numerous scholars who argue that Jude most certainly saw Enoch as scripture, considering he quotes Enoch, saying that Enoch prophesied this quote. Of course, a prophecy comes from inspiration of God, right? So not only that, but Jude says the prophecy came true. To prophesy is to speak the words of God as he reveals them to you. So how can Enoch speak the words of God, it be written down, but it not be scripture? He also uses the formula that other New Testament writers use when quoting fulfilled scriptural prophecy. Not to mention that the argument which makes up almost the entire letter of Jude relies on the Book of Watchers, which is the first section in the Book of Enoch. The last thing we will talk about on this topic is Wes mentions 1 Enoch 71, which is a passage from the portion of the Book of Parables, which, by the way, was very popular among early Christians and was used as evidence of prophecy of the coming of Jesus. Wes points out that 1 Enoch 71, 13 to 14, which is part of this Book of Parables, says Enoch was the coming Messiah, which implies that's contradictory to Scripture, so it shouldn't be considered Scripture. Of course, what Wes doesn't mention is that the rest of the Book of Parables seems to say Enoch is not the Messiah. And there's a lot of textual problems with 1 Enoch 71, so nobody's really sure what the original text said and who this Son of Man is supposed to refer to.